Hi, my dear fellows, welcome to my channel. Today, our discussion is all about Apex error, too many SOQL queries 101. Let us now try to understand why we should not use SOQL queries inside the for loop. The major reason why you should not write a SOQL queries inside for loop is because it hits the Salesforce governor limits. So Salesforce has given few pointers on this. Those are nothing but called governor limits. The one such pointer here is SOQL query limit. So during any request that passes from the user browser to Salesforce server, throughout this journey, it should not cross beyond 100 SOQL queries to fulfill the request. Suppose if you write a SOQL query inside the for loop, the moment it for loop iterates n number of times, it will keep on adding up that number of SOQL queries used that leads to hitting a governor limits. So one should not write SOQL queries inside the for loop. So apart from SOQL queries, there are few other important limitations. One which are nothing but DML statement limit and records, number of records that can be used or retrieved for one SOQL from one SOQL query. So coming to the DML statement limit, so maximum 150 DML operations can be done in one transaction. So if the user crosses this limit, then it leads to a situation where our application raises the error. And last most important thing here is the number of records that can be retrieved during the transaction. So when we have 100 SOQL queries that can be used throughout one transaction, so each SOQL query can retrieve 50,000 records at a time. So whenever user tries to retrieve more than 50,000 records at a time by using a generic query, which will have the problem. So whenever we write a SOQL query, we should keep in mind that our query should be more refined by having filters, and we should get only the required records that is relevant to our business case. Now let us see one example where we have written a SOQL query inside the for loop. In the screen you can see two for loops, where outer for loop having one SOQL query written and the inner query written on a contact. So in general, a developer which writes his coding in a lower environments or developer environment where the practical data is lacking in the lower orgs. So one cannot expect more than a few hundreds of records or else a few counts. Okay, at that moment when user tries to go with this kind of coding, he can't have any problem, since maybe the number of accounts will be limited to 100 or 150, so forth. When this kind of code goes to the production, where we can expect lakhs of accounts been created in the production, if this kind of code goes to the production, it will try to have as per the governor limits, a SOQL query will have max 50,000 records. Suppose if the outer for loop gets the 50,000 records, then it will iterate for 50,000 times from outer to inner. So whereas inner loop is having one SOQL query which will hit the governor limits just after 100th iteration. So when it goes for the 101 iteration, it will generate an error. So one should be cautious in writing the SOQL query, where he should have a more refined query, and one should avoid the SOQL query inside the for loop. This is the bad example which users should avoid in writing SOQL query inside the for loop.